Hello and welcome to HaXeZ, where in this video I'm going to be talking about the penetration testing tool or framework known as Metasploit. Metasploit is a extremely powerful framework that allows the operator to search for, configure and use a multitude of tools. It's a sort of centralized location which you can launch from the console, and if you find a particular vulnerability on a device, you can search for that vulnerability, then you can configure it, then you can launch the exploit and send over your payload and potentially get a shell back. Metasploit I believe is owned by Rapid7. I believe they bought them out and they continue to update the tool all the time. Every time I run APT I can get update. There's always updates for Metasploit, and it's probably the most commonly used penetration, or one of the most commonly used penetration testing tools. So in order to get up and running with Metasploit, it's recommended that you use a database. And the database is used for many things, but one of the things that is used for is Workspaces, which I'll be talking about later. But in order to initialize the database, you need to run the command sudo msfdb init. And then you pop in your password and that will create a database for you. As you can see, I've already got one here, so it skipped the configuration. Then when you want to launch Metasploit, you just do sudo msf console and that will bring up Metasploit after a brief loading period. And as you can see there, you have your Metasploit loaded, you've got your MSF6 prompt, and it has a lot of unique banners, which you can see by just running banner. Keep your eye out for the goose. But anyway, so once you're in Metasploit, you have loads of options, and you can type help to see the documentation. It'll take you a while to read through it. As I said, Metasploit is so vast, there's so much going on that to learn it inside out would take an entire book's worth, which people have done. They've written books on Metasploit just to tell you how best to use it. There's things I won't cover in this video, like setting global variables or using the web interface, but I want to do a brief overview of the potential of Metasploit. So once you're in Metasploit, you can check that your DB has connected correctly by doing db_status, and what you should see is that it's connected to the MSF database and the connection type is PostgreSQL. It means it's using a PostgreSQL database for the backend, and that's where it's going to save all your data. So how do you use Metasploit? Well, consider you've run an nmap scan on the target or a Nessus scan and you found that the host is vulnerable to Eternal Blue or MS17010. You can just do search Eternal Blue and that will return all the modules that are associated with Eternal Blue. Now what you will see here is the file paths for where these tools are located. You can see there we've got exploit and auxiliary. Now there are loads of there's a few different types of modules for Metasploit and auxiliary. So let's start with auxiliary. Auxiliary isn't necessarily exploitation. It can be some sort of form of active reconnaissance or some other type of scanner or fuzzer. So think of fuzzers when you're testing a web application and you want to test all the various different parameters, so you send it a fuzz or you start fuzzing those parameters with things like potential cross-site scripting or SQL or XML entity injection attacks to see if the responses are different, which may indicate that it's vulnerable. You could also do username enumeration through SMTP. It's all built in. So if we did a search for SMTP, there's going to be a lot of results, but I believe at number 25, SMTP enum, that we've used that before in another video, and what that does is that will connect to the SMTP port and send it VRFI requests based on a word list and try to enumerate the users, and that type of engagement would be considered in the auxiliary options. But if we go back to our previous example and search for Eternal Blue again, you can see there we also have these exploits, and what exploits are is they are the actual bugs or the actual tools used to exploit bugs that can gain access to a system. For instance, if you had a service which was vulnerable to a buffer overflow, whereby you send the service more information than it's expecting, and it continues to process that information after the expected data has been exceeded, that could then allow you to execute code on the machine. So essentially you could tell it to launch a shell back to you, what's known as a reverse shell, and that will be your exploit. Another type of module that Metasploit offers is post exploitation, or post. And what this is once you've exploited a target using one of the tools or modules that you find here, and you've got access to the target, you may want to look for ways to elevate your privileges or gather more information or capture hashes or set up persistence. And these types of modules will fall into the post category. And you can search for modules in the post category by just doing show post. However, once you've already got a session established, you can again chain these modules together. So you would have your session set up, then you would tell it to use a specific session, and then you would use one of these post or exploitation modules to perform some shenanigans. So you can see there's managing a webcam, lots. You can grab some CA certificates or remove CA certificates. To go through them all, as you can see, there's over, almost 400 there. Probably more if I was to run an update, but there's quite a lot there. And another type of module that we have on Metasploit is known as the payload. And what the payload is essentially when you run your exploit. So in this case, if we're still using the example of Eternal Blue, and we just select the first module as the exploit, you can see there automatically no payload was configured, defaulting to Windows x64 Meterpreter reverse TCP. So the payload is effectively the code that's sent to the server. Again, after we've talked about the buffer overflow, we talked about the code that gets executed on the server to create a shell to come back to you, or to something of that effect. And you can see here the payload that's been automatically set is Meterpreter, and Meterpreter is an extremely powerful payload as it offers a lot more in the way of functionality than a lot of other payloads. Some payloads just may give you a TCP connection back, or bash connection back, or a Python connection back, but Meterpreter has a lot of functionality that can allow you to, I think one is like get system or get users, and effectively it means you don't have to know as much necessarily about the target system in order to try and capture more information. I believe there's one called get hashes. You may not know how to get hashes if you're very new to cybersecurity, but Meterpreter has that functionality built in. And again, so that is where your payloads are, and then you can do show payloads to see all the various different payloads that you have. Reverse win HTTPS, again there's HTTP connections, TCP connections, reverse name pipe, a lot of them I'm not even familiar with what they do, a bind address, and then you got your reverse address. So those are your payloads. Now there are other types of modules as well, other module categories which I won't cover in here, things I believe to do with binary exploitation. Once you've identified a vulnerability on a target and you've selected the payload or the exploit payload that you want to use, so in this case we're using Windows SMB MS17010 Eternal Blue, what you can do is you can do show options. And this will show you the various parameters that you may or may not need to populate. The obvious one is the R hosts. Obviously that's important because you need to tell the tool or the module what host it is you want to attack. Then you have the R port, which is equally as important because you need to specify the correct port, so when it sends the payload to the target, it's sending it to the correct port rather than just any port which won't know how to interpret the data. And for this example, these categories here are optional, but again, if you provided that information, then it would authenticate and then run the exploit. So you've got the SMB domain. I'm sure you're familiar with Windows domains. When you're on a corporate network, that tends to be a domain that you sign into based on what's configured on the domain controller. And that's the same with the SMB user and the SMB pass. It's not necessarily needed for this exploit to work. It depends on the configuration of SMB version 1, I believe it is. But those are additional parameters that you may want to set. And then if we come down here, you can see that we have our host and our port, and this is equally as important as our host and our port. This is where you want to send the connection back to. So if I run an ifconfig, you can see there that Metasploit has already pre-populated my address, and it's going to open port 444 so that when the exploit returns and when the payload comes back, it will attempt to communicate on port 444, and if the exploit is successful, we should get a shell. Okay, so how do we set these options? Well, it's pretty easy. All you need to do is run set, and then you would specify the parameter, so our hosts in this case, and I'm just going to do 10.10.10.40 because I know that's an IP address of a box that I want to attack later. And then we don't need to set the port because it's already set at 445, which is the default SMB port. And our IP address is correct. We could change the local port if we wanted to, so I'm just going to change that to set our port to 1337. And then if you wanted to use the different payloads, you could do show payloads, and then you could just do set payload to whichever number it is you want. But for this case, I'm going to keep the payload as default. Okay, so we're ready to try to exploit our target now with the MS17010 Eternal Blue exploit. We've got our payload set to Meterpreter, reverse TCP. But one thing to note, especially if you're on environments like HaXeZ where you have to set up and connect to the environment via a VPN, you will have two IP addresses. Your IP address on your local network given to you by your DHCP server, but you will have a separate interface called TUN for tunnel, and you need to make sure that you are setting your localhost IP address to that IP address. As you can see there, it's currently set, but I was trying to work out why the exploit wasn't working, and then it occurred to me after noticing something on the forums that yeah, I had my incorrect IP address set. It was taking it from my ETH0 rather from the VPN. So once all that's set, you set your R host, you set your R port, you set your R host, you set your R port. In order to run the exploit, you can use two commands. There's probably more, but there's run and exploit, and one is an alias of the other. There's no difference as far as I'm aware and from what I've read in between these two options. I have heard people say that you should use run for running auxiliary scans and auxiliary modules, and you should use exploit for exploit modules. If you ask me, that's bunk, and you can run either one you want. Just run exploit, and what you should see there is that the exploit starts to send the data required over to the target host. And as you can see there, it's sending the stage. This is where it's going to be sending the payload, and we have a successful payload. And you can see there, you should, if you type help, you should have a number of options. You can grab webcam, enum desktops, list all accessible desktops, session. Again, this is just how powerful it is. You can drop down to a system level command if you want to. You can get sysinfo. It'll tell you about the box called Harris PC. But yeah, have a play. The box I'm currently exploiting at the moment is blue on HaXeZ. It's one of the retired machines, but it's one of the easiest ones that I thought I could exploit to get a demonstration for this video. So that is how you exploit a box. Okay, let's talk about sessions. So we've just exploited a Windows host that was vulnerable to Eternal Blue by using the MS17010 module on Metasploit. That created a Meterpreter session for us, whereby it created a reverse TCP connection back to our box. And once we've, run a few commands, got a bit of information about the system, you might not want to interact with it anymore, and you might want to go on and try to target a different system or look at something else. So what you can do is you can just type background, and what that will do is it will background the session, meaning it's still there, it's still active, but you are no longer directly interacting with it when you're back in Metasploit. However, what you can do is you can type sessions-l, and it will show you all the sessions that you have. So you can have multiple sessions here. If you've compromised loads of machines, you can have an entire list of machines listed out here. And then if you want to reconnect to a session, all you have to do is do sessions-i, and then the number of the session or the ID of the session, and it will drop you back into Meterpreter, where you can do something like hash dump. Grab the hashes and see if you can use them on different systems within the same network, something like that. But that's the basic concept of sessions. It allows you to manage your different connections to different machines without disconnecting from them. It allows you to continue working within the same workspace on different machines. So another brilliant use of sessions is when you want to run additional modules in Metasploit on the session that you've just popped. So you can see here we've got a Meterpreter session against our target, and Meterpreter already has a fantastic array of tools that we can use for post-exploitation, for privilege escalation. But what if we wanted to use a different Metasploit module? Well, again, we can just type background, and then we can search for local exploit, and you should see there we have a post-exploitation module called local exploit suggester. So we can use 0, and then we can do something like set session 2, I believe, and then if we check the options, you can see there we're showing session ID. Again, these ones don't require you to type in your remote host and your remote port, because it assumes you've already got a session created, so it's all based on sessions. And then you can just do exploit, and it will run through the session that you have and try to find more exploits on the box. I doubt this is going to work because we already have system, so it's a bit pointless in it running because we already have the highest privileges there can be. But it's just a good example to show you what you can do once you've established a session. Say if you just connected to a user like the www data user with lower privileges, you could run local exploit suggester, and it would search all the areas that it has permissions to search and try to find a way for you to power up your power level on the box. So the final thing I want to talk about today is Workspaces. And what Workspaces are, as they are a way for you to keep your data separate. So for instance, if you were a master hacker and you were attacking multiple different organizations at the same time, for example, say you wanted to attack the Tories or the Conservative Party and the Sun. Disclaimer, I'm not encouraging that, I'm just using it for an example for comedic purposes. But you could use Workspaces to logically separate that data. And how you would go about doing this is you would do a command like workspace-a, and then give it the name of your workspace. And there you can see it's added the workspace to Sun. But if I wanted to add another one, I just do the same command. And I add that. And then you can see all your workspace by just typing workspace. And how it works is it interacts with that database that you created earlier to keep your data separate. So any IPs you set, any sessions you create, any information you retrieve, anything in your loot box that you've collected through Metasploit will be saved to the current workspace that you are on. And as you can see from the results below, or on the screen, my current workspace is set to the Tories. But you can change the workspace simply by saying workspace the_sun, and then you can see that the asterisk is now saying that I'm working on the sun. And then once you're done and you've backed up all your data, you can simply do workspace-d the sun, and it removes that workspace for you. It's a great way to separate data. I feel like it's not mentioned all that often about workspaces. To be honest with you, I only recently found out about it, but I thought no sort of Metasploit guide would be complete without it. So that's it. That's my brief introduction to Metasploit. Granted, there is no way I could have covered everything in a single video. There is so much to Metasploit. It has things like a web interface, it has ways to add routes through hosts to get to different networks. To cover everything would take an entire book, which people have done. No Starch Press have a Metasploit book out if you're looking for recommendations. So yeah, if I've piqued your curiosity, then most distributions or security focused distributions come with it pre-installed. I know Kali Linux does, I believe Parrot OS does as well. So get one of those distributions downloaded, fire up Metasploit, and have a go at hacking boxes on your local network. Remember, it's illegal to hack anything that's public, so see my other video on hacking legally where I talk about places like Hack the Box, VulnHub and TryHackMe, where you can legally practice using Metasploit on hosts. One particular VulnHub box which is really good to practice on is Metasploitable 2. It's built specifically for the purposes of learning to use Metasploit, so have a go with that. But yeah, this wasn't meant to be an in-depth guide, it was only meant to scratch the surface of Metasploit. I've tried to cover everything that will help you get used to using it, setting the payloads, finding payloads, exploiting hosts, and I'm sure, again, there's essential stuff that I've missed, but I feel I've covered as much as I can. But yeah, I love Metasploit, as you can see. It's a great tool. I know some exams like OSCP mean like they will only let you use Metasploit once, but there's other tools to go out there and search. Once you are familiar with Metasploit, it might be time to look at things like SearchSploit and getting the specific tools and configuring them manually rather than using the Metasploit framework. Anyway, I am really rambling on, but this has been HaXeZ, this has been Metasploit. Kind regards.